Jay Perini, I know I'm speaking for Harry as well as for literary fans when I ask you, where did that flamenco dancer come from? I don't think I saw him in the original story.
That's right. If you've read the story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, you're going to wonder where this movie came from.
Right. Or great chunks of it, anyway.
Great chunks of it.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's perfectly framed within the original story. We've got the African hunting scenes. We've got the great author, or pseudo-author, dying on a stretcher while his rich wife attends him.
Right, brings him scotch and soda, I think.
She brings him the drinks, and you've got a couple of natives lurking in the background.
Right.
So that's our basic Hemingway story.
Right.
What about the flamenco dancer we just saw, or flamenco dancer?
Whatever he was a bad guy.
He was something. And what about...
the flashback scene.
All the flashbacks, the scenes with Ava Gardner on the French Riviera, on and on. Many scenes here in Paris that are not in the story.
Right.
What we've got here is a situation where Casey Robinson, the adapter, had to fill out a 2-hour movie. And Darryl F. Zanuck wanted a big movie with lots of scenes. He wanted a tunnel of love, which you rode through on a big train. And so what he did, essentially, Casey Robinson, was really get into the Hemingway story. And what we're really getting here is a kind of potted biography of the life of Ernest Hemingway with snippets from books all along the way.
Interesting.
I mean, what the flamenco dancer and the scenes of the running of the bulls in Pamplona and Madrid.
The shooting in Africa.
Well, the Spanish scenes are straight out of The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway's first great novel. The Spanish Civil War scenes, which give us a little heart tug here in the second half, are going to be taken straight from For Whom the Bell Tolls. A lot of the actual hunting scenes don't come from The Snows of Kilimanjaro at all. They come from The Green Hills of Africa, published in 1934.
So Casey Robinson, to some extent, was a great cutter and paster, as well as an adapter of Hemingway's old works.
Right. In fact, he even throws in those scenes of the young Harry Street with his uncle on these hunting expeditions up in Michigan, taken from Hemingway's first book of stories, In Our Time.
So what we have here is sort of a Hemingway's greatest hits in disguise as
That's
a book.
right.
The question has to be asked, what sort of damage does this do to the body of work that was The Snows of Kilimanjaro?
I think you could have made a very wonderful one-act play out of The Snows of Kilimanjaro, but it's a very short story, a very moving and brilliantly written short story. But you couldn't make a full-length movie out of it. So as a result, we're up against the old thing. What does the screen adapter do?
Right.
Expands, changes, often lightens for the audience, L-I-T-E.
Right.
Makes light
Hemingway
of the
light.
text. Hemingway light.
You're watching KCWU, Channel 2, Community Access Television for Central Washington.
In time, he fed all the gossip columnists with stories about his torrid love affairs and his failed marriages, his big game hunting, his drinking, his running around in a speedboat outside of Cuba. I mean, Hemingway fostered the Hemingway myth. It sold books. Hemingway needed the money. And in many ways, Harry Street has a lot in common with Ernest Hemingway.
And now, having abused, as I did a moment ago, Darryl F. Zanuck in the movie version, I think we have to admit that this, on its own terms, is a pretty entertaining movie by Hollywood standards in the 1950s.
I think it's wonderfully cinematographic. I think the scenes, the photography is beautiful. There's some wonderful wildlife scenes. We must remember that the scenes at the actual hunting camp were all shot in California. Susan Hayward and Gregory Peck never set one little toe in African dirt. They stayed a long way from African dirt. But there is some good nature photography here. And I think the Ava Gardner scenes are rather well done.
Yes.
And for those of us who love Ernest Hemingway, as I do, there's some fun in running through this kind of pseudo-anthology of Hemingway scenes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the great master. I mean, he really is one of these signal writers of the 20th century. And where does The Snows of Kilimanjaro figure in Hemingway's canon?
I think it's very interesting. In many ways, it's analogous to the movie we saw the last time I saw Paris, where Babylon Revisited was a short story at the point where Fitzgerald's career was beginning to break down. The Snows of Kilimanjaro comes at a point in Hemingway's career, 1938, when his career is starting to run out of gas, like Harry Street's was. He was starting to drink too much. His second marriage was beginning to fail. He was having real premonitions of death. His father had recently died, in fact, by suicide.
As Hemingway was to die.
As Hemingway was to die in 1959 out in Idaho of suicide. Hemingway's life was coming unraveled. He'd also begun to associate with a very, very rich crowd, much like the Susan Hayward figure in this movie, or like Ava Gardner. And he needed money to sustain big game hunting, villas on the Riviera, deep sea fishing in the Caribbean. He needed lots of cash, which made him feel that on some level he had to produce best-selling books. He was just coming off a massive failure as far as he was concerned. The Green Hills of Africa, 1934, an autobiographical novel, which is in fact non-fiction, although much of it is made up. I always think of autobiography as one of the great forms of fiction.
Right.
Right. An autobiography is when you pretend that something happened.
Kind of like a glorified expense account, isn't it?
Right. If you want to find out what really happened, you've got to turn to fiction.
Right.
That's the only place truth is ever told by novelists. But Hemingway was trounced by the critics for The Green Hills of Africa. They said, "Where is the great Hemingway of The Sun Also Rises? Where is the great Hemingway of A Farewell to Arms? He's giving us this rubbish, which is nothing but a kind of breastfeeding, self-promoting journalism." And he was really beginning to feel it.
Did he respond? Was he able to respond and regenerate himself to another great body of work?
Well, he responded by drinking heavily. And but 4 years later, he pulled himself up and was able to actually use the African material that he had gathered for the Green Hills of Africa and make a real piece of art out of it.
We're in that very thing, that making art out of personal travail and failure, we're really tapping into something tragically and almost uniquely American, aren't we, in the novel writing process? We've talked about Fitzgerald looking candidly at his broken life and broken loves in Babylon Revisited. It's interesting that Hemingway, who was one of the first writers to recognize the greatness of Huckleberry Finn and really certify that work by Mark Twain, was himself, like Mark Twain was a century before, fascinated by the wealthy and powerful. Part of him wanted to be in that milieu. The other part wanted to stand back and fire rockets into their flanks. So there is a real American lineage here, isn't there?
Yes, one critic has said, I think it's a memorable phrase, that there are no second acts in American literature.
Yes. Wasn't that Fitzgerald?
I think it was Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
Fitzgerald, obvious example, This Side of Paradise. Big book. Makes a lot of money for him. He becomes famous. What does it do? It ruins his life.
Yeah.
Hemingway has a similar trajectory to his career. Hemingway's life was all downhill after A Farewell to Arms. Actually, if truth be told, Hemingway's best book was his first book, published in 1922, In Our Time. And every book after that, The Sun Also Rises comes next, A Farewell to Arms, every book gets slightly worse. So finally, we're down to Have and Have Not, and Across the River and Into the Trees, a really terrible novel.
Movable Feast?
Movable Feast is pretty good.
Non-fiction.
Non-fiction, also published posthumously. There is one book for which he won the Nobel Prize, in fact, The Old Man and the Sea.
Oh, yes.
Now, that's a 1952, but there's some evidence that Hemingway may, in fact, have written it much earlier and put it in a trunk.
And a fairly successful movie version of that was made, starring Spencer Tracy.
I remember that.
One of the most successful.
Well, Hemingway is one of the most filmed of all writers. I mean, many of his stories have been made into movies, such as The Killers. I believe it was made 2 or 3 times into movies.
Yes.
And A Farewell to Arms with... who's the actor in A Farewell to Arms?
It was our old friend Gary Cooper.
Gary Cooper. Terrific,
He said,
right. And Helen
wildly.
Hayes, right? Helen Hayes plays opposite Gary Cooper.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting adaptation.
That brings up the question of you now as a moviegoer. who is the Hollywood leading man capable of playing the Hemingway hero? Do you think Gary Cooper came close? Do you think Gregory Peck came close in Snows of Kilimanjaro?
Well, Clint Eastwood wasn't alive in Hemingway's days. Clint Eastwood
Right.
probably would have done a good job.
I think you're right.
But Gregory Peck, I think, comes pretty close to being the ideal Hemingway hero.
Something jagged about him.
There's something, he's got that exterior hardness, yet he betrays an inner sensitivity. And always in the Hemingway hero, this is what we look for. He's tough on the outside, soft on the inside, right? Some kind of a desert fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hear in his dialogue, and we've given Casey Robinson a sort of a hard time earlier in our discussion, but I think you do hear those unique fragmentary cadences of Hemingway's sentences in the Gregory Peck dialogue and in his exchanges, certainly with Susan Hayward. This was a role that probably calls something forth from her that she may not have been asked to dip into in previous Hollywood roles. So Hemingway's women were kind of tough.
Women were tough. I think this is actually a pretty good adaptation. Casey Robinson was obviously into the Hemingway lingo. It's the kind of thing you can imitate. Hemingway's very imitable. And it's not that hard to imitate. You know, every year the Ritz, or what is the bar? Harry's Bar. Over in Venice holds a little contest to imitate Hemingway. And
there's a writer's colony down in Key West, Florida, isn't there, that everybody's singing around talking about angst. And
I know. You can imitate Hemingway, and Casey Robinson could do it. And so, in fact, Hemingway learned how to imitate Hemingway.
Yeah.
I mean, most of his later books are simply Hemingway imitations. They're not the real thing.
Yeah.
So we're getting a good version here of what Hemingway characters talked like. The dialogue, you'll notice, is very clipped and efficient. The cutting from scene to scene is very smart and swift. This is a slick movie. In fact, it was a very successful movie. It was the biggest grossing film of 1952. And believe me, theater owners were terrified when they were told that a movie was coming to them called The Snows of Kilimanjaro. They said, you can't make us put on a movie that nobody can pronounce.
Right.
Can't you give us a new title? But fortunately, Darryl F. Zanuck stuck to his guns. He said, look, this is a very famous title.
Yeah.
People will recognize it, and if they don't, they'll soon learn how to say Kilimanjaro.
And I am just old enough, I doubt that you are, but I certainly am, to remember, as I was a boy growing up in the middle of the country, but I remember an enormous publicity campaign, an advertising campaign that announced this movie. So everybody pretty soon was saying The Snows of Kilimanjaro, whether they knew what it meant or not. It was massively promoted before its release. I'd like to ask you now, Jay, the same question that I asked you a couple of weeks ago about Scott Fitzgerald, and that is, these guys were contemporaries, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. They towered over the beginning of the century in American letters. How successfully has Ernest Hemingway survived his period, and how much does he continue to resound into American literature?
I think Hemingway is still probably the most influential novelist among American writers in some ways. He took the American language, and I won't say English language, and he threw a bucket of ice water over the American language. He made it tough, tight, hard little crystals. And I think if we look at a lot of American writing today, some of our contemporary, even women writers like Ann Beattie, they look back to Hemingway for a model of coolness. The ideal Hemingway story is a story in which the real passion takes place in the margins. It's not for nothing in The Snows of Kilimanjaro that much of the story is told in flashbacks. That's even true of the story itself, not just of the movie. But the story in Hemingway is often in the margins. What we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, but a huge amount is implied.
But it can be very tantalizing and very tactile. I mean, I think when I read a Hemingway story, I always feel myself tasting that gin and bitters and feeling the roughness of those pebbles. And he has a specificity about describing things that makes you almost able to reach out and touch them. And I think that's part of the mystery and the charm of his writing.
Yeah, the prose is very tactile, it's very image-laden, it's very memorable. It's memorable language, which to me suggests that it's poetry. W.H. Auden defined poetry as memorable language.
Yes.
And I never forget a Hemingway sentence, it seems. You know, it stays in your memory. When I go back to, not that I sit here and have memorized all of Hemingway's work, but when I pick up, say, In Our Time or The Sun Also Rises, I always remember the page. even on almost where on the page the phrases were.
Well, I think his work really has had a big echo effect in the characteristic writings of the 1980s, the period we've just come through. We call it minimalism. You mentioned Ann Beattie. There are others, Raymond Carver, Bobby Ann Mason, Amy Hempel, people who write in this deceptively spare, stark, surfacey dialogue and narration, in which a lot deep worlds of meaning are left unstated, but they're sort of accessible through that prose. Deep worlds of meaning are left unstated, but they're sort of accessible through that prose.
Right, I think Hemingway, the artist, survives because the work is great. I think there's a lot of Hemingway junk, such as Across the River and Into the Trees. There are a lot of poor books, The Green Hills of Africa, which have, you know, for good reason, fallen by the wayside. I think Hemingway's had a very damaging influence on writers after him too, though, in the sense that his creation of this myth of the macho man, thinking of novelists as prize fighters who are battling it out in the, you know, for the crown, has affected writers badly. I think Norman Mailer is a writer who, unfortunately, possibly a great writer, who really is less of a writer because he has been so obsessed with the Hemingway myth and feeling that he had to somehow live up to this myth. I mean, the truth is that art is not a contest. There's no race. And
thank goodness for some of us.
The greatest writers, I think, understood this. I don't think that Shakespeare was out there thinking, is Marlowe catching up to me?
Marlowe may have been thinking it, though.
Marlowe may have been. But then again, what I'm saying is it's probably the second-rate writers who are obsessed with this whole issue of where am I in the race. I mean, the real artist pursues his or her vision.
Right. Getting back now to the movie, we saw a couple of weeks ago that the flavor and tone of The Last Time I Saw Paris began to change as we got back into the second half of the movie and closer to the original work of Fitzgerald. Does the same thing begin to happen now in The Snows of Kilimanjaro?
Once again, Dr. Bowdler raises his ugly head.
Yes.
Dr. Bowdler was the man who insisted on cutting out the dirty bits from books, making happy endings. You remember in the 18th century and 19th century when they performed King Lear, everybody lives at the end. Suddenly these dead characters on the stage stand up and they say, I'm not really dead, I was only pretending. Well, unfortunately, I'm not going to give away the ending, so don't panic out there. Nevertheless, what you're going to see in the next half is not what Hemingway wrote in The Snows of Kilimanjaro. In a great work of art, the ending comes as an organic fulfillment of what's been already established. What happens in this movie is an inorganic, severe dislocation in many ways.
You're making it sound like my wife's work, a sort of work of biochemistry, but I think as we've watched the second half of The Snows of Kilimanjaro, we will see at least a very charming and very entertaining Hollywood version of a great writer's work, and we will get back to The Snows of Kilimanjaro after this break.